Thank you very much. Good evening. I've actually prepared the text, so I don't want to sound extempore. But there's as Vishwak said, there are things that I needed to unpack, so I wanted to be accurate when I talk about. So if I read from my notes, kindly bear with me. But thank you for all for choosing to be here in solidarity to stand for freedom of expression, liberty, equality, and fraternity. And journalist Gauri Lankesh was a very fierce advocate of secularism and equality that guarantee the rights and duties of all citizens of India, irrespective of one's political, cultural, sexual, and caste identity. I'm honored to be here. Thank you, guys. Especially to share some of my thoughts under the title, Casting India, Unsettling Secular Mythologies. I mean, what you've seen here, it is very relevant and important piece of media documentary, but it also actually conveys a, I mean, it is true. It did convey as how situation is really getting graver and getting worse. But what I'd like to do now, in the next 30 or 40 minutes, take this journey a little deeper and broader. And what is happening now, it's because of what's been going on for a very long time. And why that's important to understand. And only if we understand that history and then moving forward, we will be able to really grapple with what's going on and actually challenge the current bigotry, Hindutva and Hindu nationalism and so on. As Vishwak said, Gauri Lankesh was assassinated on September 5th, 2017, when she was returning to her from work. A man whose face was obscured by a helmet approached her in the driveway, shot her from about 10 feet away. My own knowledge about her was limited at the time, and I just wanted to put that out. I knew of her and had read a few articles, especially after when she published in online magazines such as The Wire, because that happened to be in English. I began to pay particular attention to her activism, her work of activism and work, when I had heard that she was a key organizer behind the Chalo Udupi march against caste segregation, which was being practiced at Udupi temple in Karnataka. I had heard of Lankesh Patrike, of which Gauri Lankesh was the editor, and there's a backstory to it. She was actually managing her dad's magazine, weekly newspaper, and then there were some clashes, and then she was an English journalist based in Delhi, and she was not very reluctant to write in Kannada, and then it was a journey for her, and that just needs to be really contextualized in the way that she actually became much more rooted in her activism, and then became much more familiar with what was going on at the ground level, at the grassroots level. So when she was in Delhi, she was not, she was conscious, but when she moved to Karnataka, and then when she started, setting up this Lankesh Patrike, and then she started writing in Kannada, and her own understanding, and she started reading her dad's work, and then she became much more grounded in work, and then much more, aware of what was going on, and that's where she started actually moving with, getting closer with anti-caste movement, Dalit movements, and Dalit Buddhist movements, and other queer sexuality movements. But I had heard of this Lankesh Patrike, but I never read it because I cannot read or write Kannada. But in keeping with Gauri Lankesh's commitment to freedom of press and expression, I'd like to make 3 sets of observation as a way of naming and unsettling the secular mythologies of Indian media, which is often now cried over. It has just actually become unsecular in the last 5 or 6 years, right? But it's more than that. Lankesh was an outspoken left-wing journalist, and she was relatively little known outside of Karnataka. This, I note, is not an exception, but a general rule in the Indian language mediascape, where people like Lankesh, as the Columbian Journalism Review article mentioned, was known to and admired by those connected to progressive politics and causes in India, people critical of Hindu nationalism, crony capitalism, sexism, casteism. It was largely invisible. People like Lankesh was largely invisible beyond those realms. In other words, committed journalists like Lankesh are mostly invisible in Indian mainstream media. It must also be noted that Lankesh Patrike published a memorial edition of Gauri Lankesh as soon as she was assassinated, and then stopped publishing any more issues. I mean, right after that was the only issue that came out. So the Lankesh Patrika was extremely groundbreaking in local vernacular language, and she was doing all the work, and she was assassinated, and there was one issue came after that, that's a memorial issue, and after that, stopped. The media died, Lankesh Patrika died. I mean, that's despite a swelling national and international solidarity for her, obviously post-assassination and for her issues. People rallied around the world, but the media died. Fortunately, friends and supporters formed Gauri Memorial Trust and then launched Nanu Gauri, I Am Gauri, a weekly Kannada newspaper in April 2018. Our newspapers in India, especially when it's a regional one, like Lankesh Patrika, are often products of individual or groups' political passion and compassion for social justice, and are too fragile to survive in the competitive media industry. On the other hand, if you look at the media market side, the great Indian media bazaar is often peddled as the signifier of the world's most popular democracy, as an indicator, as a signifier. According to the report Media Ownership Monitor India, published by the Reporters Without Borders in January 2019, excuse me, India boasts 17,160 registered daily newspapers and 118,239 registered publications in India. It has nearly 900 TV channels, of which more than 400 are news channels. However, in print media, for instance, if you look at any particular state within India, between 2 and 4 newspapers, they normally capture over 70% of the readership in English, Hindi, Bengali, Malayalam, Telugu, Tamil, Punjabi, Gujarati language markets. So it might look like it has got a very vast, diverse, pluralistic market, but if you focus on any particular state in India, normally 2 to 4, maximum 4, minimum 2 numbers of newspapers will pretty much cover the entire state. The ownership of influential media houses in the hands of family dynasties, like Siddharth mentioned. And he went further to say that now there are corporate sectors. And Indian corporate sector is equally the family dynasties, and they both share similar caste features. So it would be naive for us to think that the economic aspects actually coming in, which are actually disrupting the caste aspect. No, they go hand in hand. The caste capital and economic capital goes hand in hand. And I also note the second observation. I also noted that when media houses, both in India and overseas, when they started to produce obituaries of Lankesh, several obituaries drew attention to a startling statistic. It was India's rank in the Press Freedom Index, compiled by Reporters Without Borders. For example, Columbia Journalism Review's article on Gauri Lankesh wrote, India ranked 136 out of 180, slower, pretty appalling, a position quite out of keeping with India's image as the world's most populous democracy. And he further went on to say, quote, Zimbabwe, before the fall of Robert Mugabe, came at 127, and India 136. While Afghanistan, merged in a grinding war, ranked 120th. Now this particular information was actually pulled out, and then it was actually used as a narrative to signify what was going on during Modi's time of rule. And this data is accurate. There's nothing wrong about it, but not an exception. And this is what I invite you to actually get to understand the large context of it. India's rank, according to Press Freedom Index, has been consistently appalling. I just looked at 20 years, 15 years. And in the 15 years, I'm not going to read out the ranking number, but it's generally 140, somewhere, exceptionally 122, 125, but generally 132 plus. And quite a few times, consistently 140. And this year, it's 140. And media actually have picked it up. And again, they actually use that as a peg to tell Modi's government how bad it is, which is true. But what I'm saying is that this trend it's been consistently appalling, which kind of actually tells us something bigger is going on in the country. Now I want to turn to a third one. I want to now turn to a related but slightly different example in Tamil Nadu. Dalit Murasi is a monthly Tamil Dalit magazine established in 1997 that is dedicated to annihilating caste and promoting social justice. Its editor Punitha Pandiyan has been facing unsurprisingly, enormous barriers to keep thing going on, to keep the magazine alive for over 20 years. So when I interviewed him for my research a few years ago, he said, the main barrier to Dalit Murasu magazine is not from state agencies. It is from ordinary people from like you and me. Our news agents who can make profits if they sell our magazine, because it's not charity, it's a viable business model. They are reluctant to display our magazines in their shops. They fear an open display. They fear an open display of Dalit Murasi it's another one. They also have a subscriber base. So what happens is that when these subscribers are often those who believe in annihilation of caste and more often Dalits and sometimes anti-caste activists. So Dalit Murasi sends this monthly magazine by post with a small wrapper into it, so people can actually see what the item was all about. So subscribers actually went and spoke to Punitha Pandiyan. They said, can you please actually wrap the entire magazine when you post them to us? Because they feared an open display of Dalit Murasi magazine in the mailbox would discourage their customers, would discourage the neighbors, looking at you're getting Dalit Murasi magazine. That's not right. So you must be belonging to something. Who are you? So these subscribers living in middle class apartments did not want to actually admit in public that they were subscribing to Dalit Murasi magazine, right? And news agents were not willing to at the time to display Dalit Murasi magazine because they feared if they did so, other people would not come and buy those magazines from their shops at all. So what we have here, the existence of dominant caste media pluralism is not indicative of diverse and democratic media institutions, nor it can guarantee the participation of various minority groups or individuals such as Gauri Lankesh or Dalits or press groups or Adivasis. So that's no indicator, that's very clear. On the other hand, according to the Press Freedom Index, because that's what we go back whenever we want to, successive Indian governments and interest groups, not just the BJP, have been stifling dissident voices such as Gauri Lankesh's in the mainstream media. So that's been happening for a very long time. And lastly and significantly, in everyday lives, dominant caste citizens reject and actively raise anti-caste dissident voices in all forms, ranging from media representation to civic protests. So I'm just drawing on these three incidences. I'm just giving you the larger picture that's been going on for a very long time, and it's really, really disappointing and scary. Therefore, the media owners and the institution thereof, the ruling class, therefore the state, and the so-called citizens, the society, all who oppose dissent voices share a common vision of a Hindu nation and caste-based societies. That's what unites them. So where do they get together? What's the connecting point of these three events that I described? So in India, you heard there are several people talking about the difference between Hindu and Hindutva, Hindu right and Hindu and all that, right? I'll come to that in a minute. In India, the formation of Hindu nation was central to the making of Indian nationalism. Early modern secular nationalists were equally responsible for narrating and normalizing Hindu-Indian cultural nationalism. Alois is one of the intellectual I hugely admire. He identifies Vedic Brahmanism as the cultural core, a pan-Indian territorial extent, and an antagonistic polarity with the Western modernity in producing the concept Hinduism, and Hindustan. They all go hand in hand. While the phenomenon of violence, what we're experiencing now, is extremely high and so shocking, such as lynching and shooting, is that's probably new. But Hindutva as such received its ideological formulation not just from the RSS, but also from moderate nationalist leaders such as Gandhi and Nehru. And that's very clear. And that's been enough scholarship has been written to expose that. A successful Hindutva movement, therefore, has always required, and this is the point I'd like to emphasize, both an aggressive and violent support base, which is what we're experiencing now, as well as sympathetic, ordinary citizens to win elections. Amartya Sen referred to these groups as the lesser proto-Hindutva believers. So you need these two types too. In fact, you need the second one, the lesser proto-Hindutva. You need them more to actually win the battle. So that's the dangerous thing. We often pay attention to the violent trope, but the violent trope, what actually makes the violent trope ticks? You have these masses behind it, that ordinary people like you and me. Sen aptly captures the blur of fluidity between hardcore Hindutva advocates and the ideologically sympathetic soft Hindus. Hard and soft. The term is actually, it's very blurring. I mean, I'm very uncomfortable, but for the sake of actually dividing them into two boxes, I think that's the way that should be settled into. But they both are actually, deep in heart, they want to be part of the Hindu nation and they want to create Hindu nation. So the blur and fluidity between hardcore Hindutva advocates and ideologically sympathetic soft Hindus who help fuel and realize the dreams of the Hindutva projects. Sen argued that the hardcore Hindutva advocates are in fact relatively small in number, but around them cluster a much larger group who may be called proto-Hindutva believers, who are typically less zealous than the Hindutva champions who are actually out in the road, trying to kill people, but who could nevertheless be moved in the direction of Hindutva, or even to become a violent, hardcore Hindutvas if necessary, by a sense of pride associated with their Hindu identity. In other words, what connects proto-Hindutva believers with the hardcore group is the notion of Hindu pride, caste supremacy, and identity. I mean, Baba Sahib Ambedkar put it succinctly in his final address to India's Constituent Assembly, which is absolutely relevant. I mean, as if he has lived in 2020 and had seen it. I am of the opinion, I quote, I am of the opinion that in believing that we are a nation, we are cherishing a great delusion. How can people divided into several thousands of castes be a nation? The sooner we realize that we are not yet a nation, and not as yet a nation, in the social and psychological sense of the word, the better for us. I mean, he would be accused of being anti-national today. For then, only we shall realize there's a necessity of becoming a nation and seriously think of ways and means of realizing the goal. And he went on. In India, there are castes. The castes are anti-national in the first place because they bring about separation in social life. They're anti-national also because they generate jealousy and antipathy between caste and caste. But we must overcome all these difficulties if we wish to become a nation in reality. For fraternity can be a fact only when there's a nation. Without fraternity, equality, and liberty, it will be no deeper than coats of paint. And to him, according to him, the Constitution can provide necessary, this is extremely important, and in my view, the Constitution can provide necessary organs to preserve the state. But the nation represents a spirit of homogeneity towards fellow inhabitants, sharing compassion, shared culture, and sense of community. This community may be an imagined community, abstract community, or self-defined group. And to Ambedkar, that didn't happen. That is yet to happen, in fact. Which is why the Hindu nation always moves around the rhetoric of Hindu nation. I mean, Hindutva as the state. They want to actually build a strong state. And they use the word nation and state loosely, in a blurring way, but there's a difference to it. The history of Indian cultural nationalism and the role of mass media in creating the Hindu nation has not been inclusive of members of oppressed caste and minorities. I'd like to give a few examples so that we understand that how it's not just happening today. One example is the iconic Bharat Mata is inevitably Hindu, Sanskritic mother, and effective cultural representation of Hindu motherhood commonly found in temples in North India. Bharat Mata freed the Hindu nation idea from its religious exclusivity and converted into Sanskritic Hinduness into pan-Indian political rhetoric. The visual image of Bharat Mata imposed on the map of India is a visceral invocation of Hindu goddess as India's mother. When the renowned artist M. Hussain drew Bharat Mata in the nude, those who attacked him did so because Hussain, a Muslim, dared to disrobe a Hindu mother. These events are not isolated events, but continuums of nation-building project that began with a caste elite independence movement with active support and involvement from the Indian mass media. Because if you look at the way that Bharat Mata was projected as a kind of household cultural image, Indian mass media played a major role in it at the time. And you might like to read Sumadhi Ramaswamy's work on that. Of course, the BJP's version of nation building has become more virulent, tolerant, violent, very unsettling than the non-BJP forms. However, the BJP version cannot exist without the other one. So that's the reality of it. So we just have to again go back and look at the larger continuums of it. Indeed. So if I keep actually, saying negative things about Indian cultural nationalism and media, if Indian mass media is part of the Hindu nation building project, then how do we account for the democratic and civic sensibilities of Indian media? Because there are some, it's not all bad. So indeed, Indian mass media have opened up their news and opinion spaces for the others to participate, and that has shaken up Indian media system to some extent and their organizations. The gradual proliferation of Dalit writers in mainstream media and the space for dissent voices in leading dailies, both in English and vernacular language, do sit alongside brazen, unsecular, and intolerant news content. So it's not the entire landscape is changing. They're getting some good spaces. As a result, some dialogues are happening, and in some contexts and in some spaces, some changes do happen. But this post-independent trend offers a sense of comfort, especially to upper caste liberals. But it is short-lived if one pays attention to the nuances of narratives by upper caste progressives and their embedded caste consciousness that continues to be normalized in Indian media. The modern caste narrative often normalizes caste into class and then into Hindu culture. As a result, caste consciousness can continue to thrive even within the progressive media sphere as it has persisted without ruptures from pre-colonial Raj to post-colonial secular society. A few days ago, an opinion piece on Jaipur Literary Festival appeared in The Guardian, UK. Liberals and leftists, as you probably know, have been criticizing this festival for its commercial and media partnership with G Media Group, which is known for its active pro-BJP positions, and I don't want to go into that. So a Delhi-based, so this is the background in which this particular piece got published in the Guardian newspaper. A Delhi-based freelance dominant caste journalist defended the festival while recognizing, to be fair to her, some aspects of criticism. But she said the festival is important and necessary to some groups of people because Indians, she wrote, particularly in small towns, are starved of culture and long for knowledge and ideas. And this quote is actually an example of where she uses the term rural. It's a very subtle reference to caste marker and class marker, and it kind of normalizes certain caste consciousness. And this reference to the uncultured, who is often referred to the uncultured in Indian Hindu society, illiterate, and of course poor villagers. Or in another instance, to say that how you can be progressive, but you can still actually, reveal yourself within the progressive, framework. In another instance, when the public intellectual Ramachandra Guha recalled, when he was 6 years old, he wrote in Swaraj magazine, news online magazine, he wrote that how tears flowed from his eyes. He said flowed more freely because the leader that he cried for, who had just died, came from my own community of Tamil Brahmin. So, if you look at, there might be an immediate question from academic community that I'm picking out my convenient anecdotes to say what I want to say. But my response to that is that everyday practices, it's just not happening within media, but it also affects media, what's happening in the larger aspect of society. And you can actually have a liberal institution, but you can still see how things can slip through the cracks. And therefore, research on Indian news and media hardly deals with structural and practice-oriented cost consciousness in the sector. So classical and Western-oriented media research methods, such as content analysis, media representation analysis, framing methods, analysis of effects and impact, have their own importance, but they lack non-essentialist approaches like the practice-oriented methods. You have to look into why this person used the term rural people are starved of culture, where that comes from. And that actually is reflective of that person's articulation in the outer world, and then how the person actually internalizes certain consciousness or class consciousness, and how that is expressed in certain manner, in certain ways, and how that gets received in the international media. That's another aspect to it. If the Eurocentric traditions of media studies homogenize a heterogeneous set of global cultural practices, then the media and communication scholarship produced by dominant cost Indian scholars who tend to follow Western theoretical frameworks, often in aid of actively invisibilizing, thus retaining the hegemony of caste. So, during my research, I did look at, how many articles were published. I did a bibliometric analysis of how many articles were published in communication studies, from caste perspective. Hardly none. And I'm talking about 3 major databases that looked for over 70 years. So it is not accidental. It's how they're trained to produce scholarship. So what I'd like to do now, building on my research work, I propose articulation as a communication analytic, using the practice approach to unpack how caste consciousness is normalized, not just in the so-called BJP camp, but also in the progressive media spaces. So let me begin by reflecting on why the practice approach, which I kind of preempted a little bit, but let me explain that properly. The practice approach shifts the focus of media research from the study of media texts, or production structures. That's a very classical way of studying media. You study the text, or you study the production structure, political economy, ownership pattern, technology, and so on and so forth. Well, acknowledging their importance, but it moves the focus from that and then redirect onto the study of open-ended range of practices focused directly or indirectly on media and around the media, but focusing on the society. You decenter the media to study the media. So if you want to actually look at consciousness and how that actually gets embedded in media structure, you don't study media. You look at the articulation of caste, practices of caste in the wider context, and then see how that gets actually reflected and recirculated in the media at various levels. So the practice approach is rooted in the non-essentialist tradition, and it's best suited to understand the functions and working of grade and inequality of caste in a messy and everyday lives. And after all, caste is constitutive of and constituted by everyday communication that produces hierarchy-based social relationship and participation in society. If you look at the kind of experiences one has in relation to caste, Ambedkar very clearly when I mentions the term excommunication. is one of the punishment category when it comes to when you breach the hierarchies. It's excommunication, exclusion, and ostracization, and all these are communicative elements. So which is why I think it's important to absorb that and see how that actually played out also in the media sector as well. So I use this articulation. I use articulation as a communication analytic, but using media practice approach. Let me explain then what I mean by articulation itself, because often people think articulation is actually a clarity of speech or an emphasis of utterances. It's not so. Articulation reveals us the work of politics of power in the structure and experience in life. I'll give you not my example, Laclau's example. He says, if the neighbors actually having fight, they don't have very smooth relationship. Removing a brick can be an articulation, the middle brick. You don't have to talk. But that removing brick actually is loaded with meaning, and it has a particular specificity, it has a particular cultural function in that particular moment that you want to actually convey. So you need not speak, you need not write, but it's a kind of it's a communication elements coming together, and you pick one particular moment and use that to tell people. I mean, this is very important during my own research. When people pick up the mobile phone and if they know that they received a call from a Dalit person, they don't talk, because that articulation means I'm not going to talk. You have to talk to me. Another person then will have to initiate the conversation in a very honorific manner, and there's a whole process that needs to happen before you make that dominant caste person to open his or her mouth, and that silence is an articulation itself. So the reason I'm using this, that articulation can be used as an analytic when looking at, when understanding the caste consciousness of mainstream media. Just an example, it's a very obvious example, the appearance of Brahmin food, marketed assets under culture and lifestyle. Is one example of, how do you want to place certain things in certain place. But that also actually means that articulation also refers to the next point I want to make. It talks about culturalizing caste. So you articulate so that the point, the discourse here you want to actually promote, you want to culturalize caste. So at the same time, if you look at the other side of the reporting in the mainstream media, let's say for example, the death of manual scavengers. Media mostly invisibilizes caste identity when reporting deaths of manual scavengers. Next time when you read a report on manual scavengers in Indian media, it always says manual scavengers, it professionalizes the death. It doesn't actually come forward to expose the link between fatality and caste-based occupation in modern caste societies. So you can see, on one hand, you culturalize caste. On the other hand, you try to professionalize something. In doing so, you like to invisibilize it. Right? You conceal it. Sorry, I'm just. Do I have more time or? Yeah. Okay. So I mean, this is particularly happening now in this time. Caste is increasingly articulated as culture and media and political narrative. You see that everything that's been said in the past now it's been recirculated as it is our heritage and culture as our identity, and in the context of Hindutva politics. If hardcore Hindutvas are blatantly, for example, appropriating Ambedkar to build armies of proto-Hindutva believers from, let's say, Dalit Bahujan groups, then the secular progressive is keen to de-ritualize and to climb culturally positive Hindu India. Let me unpack this. So you have on one side the BJP hardcore Hindutva groups who are trying to woo BJP, Dalit and Bahujan cadres, and they're trying to bring them into the fold by opening up this identity politics. We're all one part, one culture. But then you also have the secular progressive in response to that. They want to reclaim, which you saw in the video, they want to reclaim Hindu religion as a very soft and benign one and needs to be distinguished from Hindutva. So what they want to do, they want to de-ritualize caste and produce culturally positive narrative. And both are equally problematic. And there is this liberal consensus that India's secular credentials have hit a record low with the rise of political rule and power of Bharatiya BJP. And that's in a sense true. And through its close ideological association with RSS. But this consensus also, again, this is the response from secular Hindu progressives. The consensus also has resulted in the articulation, and going back to that analytic, in the articulation of Hindu right. They started producing this category called Hindu right, which is very normalized now. If you are in a very progressive secular circle, you hear this two typology, Hindutva, Hindu right on one side, and then you don't hear what's the other side, do you? Because there's no Hindu left. But you keep hearing Hindutva, Hindu right, and then they go back to, they say, well, but we want a Hindu religion, which is secular, de-ritualized, and that's not possible. And if you can't say like that. I mean, I don't want to go into that literature now, because when they keep saying Hindu right, there is this implicit, they implicitly invoke there's something a mythical Hindu left present somewhere. But what I normally see, it's always secular, upper caste, progressive left. So what happens then? So when they do that, they claim the role, the dominant role to negotiate with Hindutva and Hindu right-wing group, and leaving the rest behind. I don't know if that makes any sense. So the Hindu right wing are very blatantly open, and we don't know that. But then the secular leftists, upper caste leftists, keep claiming, they are the one negotiating with it because they are the one who is going to claim the Hindu religion, because other people have no stake in it. So by doing that, it becomes a cousins' fight. So again, in that particular discourse and narrative, anti-caste activists, Dalit intellectuals have no place in many ways. So it just keeps, the chain the loop is between themselves. And that's something important. This is what, this is where the articulation is very key to understand. And then the media have been extremely, significant in promoting this Hindu right as a legitimate category. Which is really interesting, because who promoted that? And then you need to look back, and then people who started talking about the Hindu right at the earlier time, then you will then be very surprised to see the type of intellectuals that we always actually held them in high regard, and they were the one who actually bent on popularizing this Hindu right as a legitimate category. I don't want to name anyone, but if you want, you can go back and read a bit on that. So the point I'm trying to make, the analytic of articulation that allows us to look deeply into the highly sophisticated mechanisms of modern caste manifestations, particularly its functioning in close relation to neoliberal marketization, which is why I said I don't believe the narrative that it's no longer family dynasty in Indian media ownership, it's moving on to corporate sector. No, it's the same. It's the same, but it kind of reconfigures in different ways. Like the caste manifests in different ways. The narratives go back and change, but the essence and core of caste system remains the same. I'm coming to the end. In the last section, what I'd like to do, it's not just actually in the legacy media or print TV media, what is happening here. It is also permeating into digital cultures. So it's kind of I just want to actually stress that continuum is actually alive and active, and it keeps on moving forward So it's therefore, unless we recognize that past, we won't be able to actually grapple what's going to happen and what's already starting to happen. So to give you an example, a few examples of that, I'm sure that you are familiar with this. The articulation again of India's digital or IT success has a very strong caste color. I mean, way back in 2006, I think, Time magazine ran a cover called India Inc. I'm sure that you must have seen that cover. And it's a very glamorous, possibly South Indian looking woman with, all those, the jewelries and everything, all the markers, you can see that it belongs to a Brahmin caste. And it's very distinctive and it's very glamorous, very exotic and oriental. And then the story, kind of perpetuates since then. The IT success or a digital, the success in the valley belongs to certain groups. In fact, Prospect magazine, which is considered to be one of the, again, quote-unquote, progressive magazine from this country, and there, I think in 2004, yes, there was an article in which the magazine, the author attributed the Indian genius of IT success to the pedagogic and intellectual traditions rooted in Sanskrit Vedas. And these articulations were consciously, obviously, exported by Hindu Indians, right? And the next one is really interesting and surprising, but equally sad. In 2007, development economist and Nobel laureate Amartya Sen, he made a speech to the Trade Association of Indian Information Technology, NASCOM, and the BPO Association, where Sen explained India's IT success was he explained the success through its historical respect for distinctive skills and seeing it as a social contribution. That is Sen. Now, what's especially relevant here is the way that in which Sen's thoughtful, accurate theorization of soft and hard Hindutva sits with apparently no conscious discomfort alongside his clear reference to the occupational hierarchies of caste as a marker for contemporary India's success. Now, this is an important example how, generally dominant caste elite leftists, have no problem and very conscious and aware of caste ideology and their evil consequences without paying sufficient attention to the deep internalization of caste consciousness. So it's therefore not surprising that this caste-positive articulation is gaining recognition in the international circuits as well. I mean, there's a book by Chris Puller and Haripriya Narasimhan called Tamil Brahmins, The Making of Middle Class Caste. And that book argued, excellent ethnography, I must say, that book argued that Tamil Brahmins have successfully used the historical association between Brahmin caste status and high levels of education to boost self-image as well as an ideal elite worker image within the system of global capitalism. And, he even introduces a concept called middle class caste. I don't know what that is. The conceptualization of middle class caste deserves definitely more attention and discussion, but my focus here is that to point out the extension of dominant caste narrative from legacy media to digital media. While on the one hand, you have all this actually reiteration of recirculating the dominant caste narrative as the reason behind India's IT success. The other side of the same spectrum of digital cultures, we see caste hierarchies seem to perpetuate in certain areas of digital cultures. One example is platform economy. We all know platform economy, I think. So it's like Deliveroo. Deliveroo, Swiggy, that's gig economy, platform economy. So Indian platform, I'll give an example from, I think at the time it was Uber, yeah. India's platform economy, ride-hailing services tend to have established quite a unique category called taxidars. We know that in Uber, what's happening here is that, the guy who actually comes and picks you up, or the woman who comes and picks you up, generally is the owner of the car. It's very exceptional, and the person actually hires the car and then does something about it, which happens in London cabs generally. But what happens in India is that not many drivers have money to actually buy cars. So you have lots of drivers who can potentially, scale up the Uber economy, but then, they don't have capital. And they come from a certain working class, social caste, capital class network. And then you have this middle class entrepreneurs who have money, who can actually buy cars, but, they don't drive, or they can't drive 10 cars, right? So in India, Uber has created an intermediary platform, which they have not developed anywhere else. And this intermediary platform, what it does is that either you can actually own a car and become an Uber driver, or you can become a semi-employer. So you will be attached to Uber, and you have 5 or 10 Uber drivers under you, and you make them work. And these guys, these drivers, are Uber is not responsible for anything anyway, but in this case, they have nothing to talk to Uber at all. So the middleman, say me, in this case, I'm called taxidar. It's an interesting term. So we have Uber, taxidar, and driver. So taxidars actually control the drivers. So this model itself has actually unpacks how the traditional hierarchies actually perpetuate in digital economy and gig cultures, especially in cost-effective societies. And I was doing some research, and I went through one of these blogs. It's called TBHA, I think. It's one of the very crazy blog on automobiles in India. Team BH, I think. Team BH, is that? BHP, okay, thank you. Teambhp.com, that's correct. So you will see, it's like a TripAdvisor sort of, people come and share the information about automobile and so on and so forth. Very credentialed and credible, apparently. So one of the taxidar, he was blogging about his experience in the Team BHP. And his taxidar was actually saying how, certain communities, use the word communities, certain communities actually are known to be notorious. I don't want to name them. And certain communities from certain places are better because they are docile and submissive. So you went on actually profiling. So which all kind of old things coming back and reappearing, remanifesting in gig economy. And at the same time, gig economy and tech giant platforms, they have absolutely no clue. And at the moment, there is no regulation in the platform itself. And also we know, the other popular stories that how people are refusing to take food from certain people, how people are actually rejecting food and all that. So you can see that how social hierarchies and other contemporary intolerances are actually appearing to be remanifest in gig economy. So it's important to understand this articulation will continue, whatever form the media and communication sector is going to take place. It's not that, so therefore what I'm trying to say, the term disruptive economy, disruptive platform system may not be particularly relevant and efficient and impactful in cost-effective societies like India. Right. So therefore the tech giant companies should be aware of it, but they're not. And one of the reasons I suspect is that, who are actually close to them, because if you look at the narrative that who is behind the IT success, so there is a gap in between in terms of actually taking this agenda further. Unlike if you look at the US, race, when it comes to issues like artificial intelligence, machine learning, and algorithm, big data, the racial politics have begun to play a huge role. And politics of sexuality has begun to, enter into it. And then they're talking to people, what is that you're talking about? You need to talk to experts from black history people, black sociologists. You should talk to them, and before you actually come up with your big artificial intelligence mechanism. But such conversation I don't know when that's going to happen, but we are already seeing the negative effects of it for that. So what I've done so far is kind of attempt to give a brief insight to the formation of subtle workings of caste and its complex imbrication within Indian media, as well as Indian traditional media, legacy media, print, news, online, as well as digital technologies and forms of contemporary capitalism. I mean, the brutal tragedy of Gauri Lankesh's assassination is one instance of the relentless, unreported, and unaddressed violence of many Dalit, Adivasi, Muslim, and numerous other communities subject to that. The violent, as I've tried to demonstrate here, must be understood as much broader than that physical and visceral violence. It's the violence of everyday practice that's often actually articulated and packaged into mainstream media and so on. And the normalization of caste as culture, history, and private identity. Caste can never be private. It's only within this kind of a polyvalent, complex, and practice-based analysis that we can begin to recognize and address caste violence and work to annihilate caste. Dr. Ambedkar. Thank you.
I mean, it's a small group. Yeah. It's a small group. It's a small group. You can talk loudly.
Okay, we don't.